into what we call the, oh, sorry, I got interrupted there. We're coming into like the smart chargers as well, and the protection that they provide and the requirements they need, and they need to be installed.
So I think that's a good point, because previously with the TNCS systems, if it was a TNCS system, you've got a combined neutral and earth, the DNOs would not let you allow to them or add to them, because they would need to guarantee that that would remain a TNCS system for the life of the installation.
TNS.
Sorry, TNS, my apologies, got my letters all mixed up again. No DNO would ever agree and say that that will remain a TNS for the life of the installation. So it always had to have that earth rod fitted. And where now with open fault detectors, that's no longer a requirement, which makes the installation a lot easier and minimises risks of actually installing earth rods in unknown areas on customers' properties, which is a significant risk. So I've already mentioned the actual home charge grant scheme as well. That home charge grant scheme has been in force for a couple of years now, where as a domestic consumer, you can apply to the actual government for £350 grant, or 75% maxed at £350 for the actual installation costs of your home point charging infrastructure. That is closing now. As of the end of March, that home charge grant scheme has gone. So what perceived sort of impact we think that'll have on the industry, especially in a domestic situation? Speaking to quite a few installers over the last month or two, they're expecting it to have a huge impact in the domestic installer scheme. Anecdotally, people have found it too much, shall we say, hassle to actually register with the grant scheme and do all the paperwork to claim the money back, to the extent that they've not wanted to get into this field of the industry in the home charge point installations. Now that a grant scheme's gone, a lot of people are expecting the smaller organisations to take it up a lot more. So I personally think it's going to expand the industry to one-man bands, whereas previously smaller companies didn't have the personnel, didn't have the expertise, didn't have the time to deal with the grant situation. And unfortunately, because there's a grant out there, people always want to claim it.
I think it needs to be said there as well, if people are going to expand into this, what Paul started with, it's worth doing the course so that you understand all the sort of ins and outs. It is simply installing a radial circuit in some ways, but there's more to it than that.
There's a lot more intricacies involved in it, which is why when a couple of years ago, they obviously replaced the original code of practice. We're now on the 4th edition of the IET code of practice for installation of electric vehicle charging equipment. Now, the code of practice is a legal document. I think that's where a grey area, and people often have different opinions. It's almost the same as saying, is the 18th edition wiring regulations a legal document? Technically, no, but it's best practice, best guidance, and it will be used against you in a court of law should you do something against it. So I've already mentioned the home charge grant scheme, and now a lot of people aren't aware, but actually is another grant scheme available, which is the workplace charge grant scheme. That particular grant scheme works in a very similar way to the home charge grant, but it's there for businesses, for companies, for employers. At the moment, there is no published date of when or if that is going to close, so that is still being actively promoted at the moment. It works slightly differently, whereas on the home charge grant scheme, it's up to the installer to apply to the government to claim the grant money back, whereas the workplace charge grant scheme doesn't. It's you as the business owner that applies to the government, and then what they will give you is up to 75% of the installation cost, capped at £350 per single socket outlet. And now you may think, well, I'm actually installing 8 sockets. That's absolutely fine. The grant scheme is capped at a maximum of 40 sockets. So I think that's of big interest for a lot of organisations, including ourselves, because we've just started installing electric vehicle charging points across all our centres. Initially, where we've got a limited parking infrastructure, it's going to be for staff. but some of our other centres where we've got adequate parking, we're going to have a couple dedicated for staff. Then we're going to install some more that are going to be publicly accessible charge points. And that still comes under the workplace charge grant scheme. Any thoughts on that one, Paul?
Yes, it's encouraging to see that they are still keeping the workplace grant scheme going. As I say, when it comes to the home plan, again, as you said, Stuart, it's a lot of sole traders wouldn't really apply for it. I mean, they're busy making money and making the business, whereas say now that's going to be finished, and that's going to bring a lot more people into the fray, as it was.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah,
it really is. And again, anecdotally, people are discussing the price as well.
yeah.
A lot of people are saying that the cost of installing the actual electric vehicle charge points has been potentially artificially inflated, just so the installers can actually recoup some of that money back by the grant scheme, because they know that it may cost £600 to supply and install a charger, but the government pays £350, so we'll market them at £700.
Yes.
It's an artificial markup. So again, there's anecdotal evidence that once there's more installers come on board without the grant scheme, the actual price will come down anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the costing, like every new technology, whether it be a TV or an EV charging point, it's always pricey to start with, and that should settle down in the near future as I say the market expands on the installers.
Yeah.
Do you know, Stuart, if the workplace grant is per site or per business?
Now that is something I'm not aware of. I honestly don't know whether it's per site or per business. I can certainly find out. And again, a quick search on the government website for the workplace charge grant scheme will give you all the information on there, and it gives you all the actual links to the forms that you need to fill in.
Yeah, it's OZEF now, isn't it? The Office for Zero Emission Vehicles as opposed to low emission vehicles.
Yes. Yeah, my apologies. I've traditionally always called it the OLEV grant because that's more what people sort of recognise it as.
Yeah, I know, and I'm trying to stop myself from saying it anymore.
But it's a good point. It is a good point that obviously things do change the names, and with the grant schemes changing as well, it is difficult to try and keep up with all these changes. It really is. Obviously see from the chat, there's a few people that weren't quite aware that the workplace charge scheme was actually in place. So there you go. We can all take something away from today. So my next thought then, this is something that's been widely debated throughout industry, widely debated. Do we have the actual infrastructure to cope with the rise in plug-in electric vehicles? Now, when I'm talking about plug-in electric vehicles, that's obviously pure battery and plug-in hybrids, because they all need a charge point. Yes, you can still use plug-in hybrids on the actual traditional fossil fuel, but to get the maximum benefit out of them for the environment, which, let's face it, we all live in this environment. That's what this is all about, trying to reduce pollution levels, trying to reduce our carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide levels, etc. That's what this is all about. So do we have the infrastructure? At the moment, possibly it's a building industry, I would like to say. There is the infrastructure there at the moment, but it can be very regionalised. A lot of the public charge points are based around the central hubs. Now, when you're obviously doing distances, that can be a problem, which is why, again, a lot of companies and organisations, hotels, are installing publicly accessible charge points. Some companies I know and that I actually deal with on a day-to-day basis have installed publicly accessible charge points just to cap up the numbers. So at the moment then, how many new electric vehicles are registered at the moment? In 2021, there were 190,727 new pure battery electric vehicles registered in the UK. Quite a lot, up from 108,000 the previous year. Now, plug-in hybrids, 2019, 67,000 new ones registered on our roads. 2020, 114,000. So that's typically a 60% jump in the last couple of years for plug-in vehicles. go back to 2019, plug-in vehicles have increased the market share by 590%. They've increased by 590%. That is a significant rise, is that? A significant rise. And the numbers are only going to go up and up and up. As more people get more confidence, more people are going to adopt them. Ourselves at Develop, we've got our carbon zero strategy, which we're obviously promoting. So all new company and fleet vehicles have to be, as a minimum, plug-in hybrid or preferably fully electric. And as more and more corporate clients are getting on board with that, the numbers are going to rise drastically. So we've seen in the last couple of years, 590% increase in plug-in vehicles. Now, does anybody like to have a guess about the percentage increase in public charge points in that time? Does anybody in the little chat room want to have a little guess at that?
For the public one?
Yeah, publicly accessible charge points.
Right.
This doesn't take into account home charge points or destination charges, just publicly accessible charge points. So we've had a 590% increase.
So,
Oh yes, and in the chat room, people are saying 50%. Oh, and 1,000%.
I will say the 50% is the closest. There's actually been an increase in 70%. That is all. 70%, which isn't a vast amount, is it really? So the technology and the adaptation of the actual vehicles is clearly outstripping the infrastructure, which I think everybody knew that was going to happen. But
I think this is why, be honest with you, Stuart, people are going in for the hybrids for the moment. I mean, you see the increase in the hybrids as well, because until the confidence and the general public and commercial as well comes in, as you say, the figures show there, it's been a 590% increase in these vehicles, but only a 70% increase in availability of charge points.
Absolutely, yeah. And it is very much a chicken and egg scenario.
Yeah,
it is. We need the vehicles on the road to push the installers to get the charge points in place. Likewise, we need the charge points in place to make them more usable, as it were. Personally, I'm on the fence, but I've got an electric vehicle on order. I'm adopting that style of driving, so I'm more than happy with that. One of the questions that's come in, what's your opinion if there's sufficient grid capacity on a large scale for the conversion to say 60% of households adopted them? I will go to what the National Grid are saying. The National Grid and the Energy Networks Association are quite clear in saying they do have the capacity. They do have the clear capacity to support large-scale adoption of electric vehicles. However, what they don't have is the peak demand capacity at the moment. And then there's the local infrastructure, which is part of the installation problems. So the National Grid are saying, yes, absolutely, we've not got a problem with that. But it's just balancing out that peak demand, just spreading out across the days, which is why one of our points we'll come to later on is why the rules are changing. The actual smart chargers rules are changing as of June this year. So we'll have a little bit of a chat about that later on. So who wants to pick up the next point then? Yep,
that will be me. The advantages of combining solar and home battery storage units. Now, it's the idea is the fact is that if we say for a hypothetical situation, we're all on electric cars, is that the grid, because they've got loads of batteries basically sitting in a driveway, and if they're doing nothing, they can actually draw off these as well, so it can be included into the national grid as well as taken from the national grid. Solar panel, well, we all know about solar energy. It's been around for decades now, so maybe that can be incorporated as well as part of the the charging facility. I mean, my ideal world, it'd be great if all cars had solar panels on them and they're all electric, but that may be coming along.
I think there was one that was trialed, was it either in China or Japan earlier on this year, and where it's a vehicle which is fully powered by solar panels. It's in a prototype stage at the moment, but instead of having a paint on, it's completely covered in flexible solar panels. And now, because it's a prototype, it's fully working. However, it needs about 2 days of charge to do
Right.
about 20 miles.
Oh, okay. So there's the excuse now. Sorry, I'm late. I've just had to wait for the car to charge up.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm going to use that one.
So the technology is advancing, and the more people adopt it, and the more issues also with the whole climate change is going to push the manufacturers to adopt it and develop it even more. If we go back to 10 years ago when the first Nissan Leaf came on the market,
Yeah.
they were seen as a bit of a comedy car.
Mm.
Totally unusable, ridiculously bad battery life, etc. But how much has that technology moved on in the last 10 years to make it actually usable? And that's the main thing.
I think it also needs to be said there's a sort of a shift in attitude now, isn't there? Because we're all sort of accustomed to the idea of smart this, smart that, smart the other. So we've got our smart meters and our smart heating controls and everything. And our electric vehicles and our solar panels all buy into that idea that we can have more control and feed the electricity where we need it at that moment and use any storage capacity we've got to feed it where it's needed. And although that's still in its infancy, it kind of needs a shift in attitude from people to get used to the idea of taking, pun intended or not intended, taking charge of their electricity. Sorry, I can't think of any other way to say that. Taking charge of their electricity usage and generation. So it's like turning us into prosumers, which we know is the new Part 8 in the Second Amendment of the 18th edition coming out soon.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Ali. It's good. So who I'm going to ask this question to, I think Ali's probably our installations expert on this one. So issues found with installing. This is often more primarily aimed in the domestic consumer market, not necessarily the industrial sector. But from a domestic consumer, we've all heard horror stories about how people can't get them installed, how they've had to have the whole drive dug up just to get them installed. So what do you think the main issues and solutions around that, Ali?
Well, yes, mind you, you've had personal experience of some of this, haven't you? So one of the main issues is loop supplies, in which the code of practice clearly says contact the DNO and let them make a decision, which may be that it needs unlooping at a cost.
All additional costs and all additional digging up your nicely new paved driveway.
So that's one to bear in mind. The other thing is, which if you've looked at the code of practice, you'll know that we have load limiting. So if the domestic property, if it's less than, if you're not going to take its maximum demand over 60 amps, it's fine. You can go ahead and install it, bearing in mind the loop supplies, bearing in mind if it's TNCS or TNS, then you'll probably need to fit an open system monitoring so that you don't get the break in the pen conductor problems. But 60 amps is the magic number. Above that, you have to inform the DNO because, again, it comes back to loading across the grid. Now, in the UK, despite when we do all our diversity calculations and everything, when in the UK, the UKPN design assume that most houses use in the region of 2 kVA. So the chances of a EV charging point taking the house above 60 amps demand is quite low. However, you need to look at each house, each property that you're going to in turn and make that assessment. That's part of the risk assessment that needs to be done before you install any EV charge point, which feeds me back into why it's worth doing a course before you start installing them so that you don't fall foul of something post-installation.
I think that's an interesting point that you bring up, that every house is different. Because I know my house, 3-bedroom semi in the suburbs, I've got a very low electric consumption. However, I've got a high number of circuits on my consumer units, on my 2 consumer units. So if you add up, diversity factor, etc., on that, I'm probably in about the 80 to 90 amp range.
Well, I suppose with the introduction of smart meters, you can monitor your actual electricity usage and see what your actual demand is, because that's one of the pieces of information they'll give you. But we all know, don't we, that having 30 or 40 sockets and 4 or 5 ring mains in a property doesn't mean that they're actually drawing any current. They may be drawing next to no current, all of them, unless there's something heating attached to them, some heat idea attached to them, like a kettle.
Absolutely, and that's what I did with my house. I split all my rings up into various different areas just for convenience more than anything.
Yeah.
However, you then add the factors 80, 90 amps, which is absolutely ridiculous. But like I say, as the UK power networks design every house on an estate based around a 2 kVA load, 2 kilowatt load essentially, do they even have the local supply? Probably not, to put everybody on a full powered EV charging point at the time. So what they need to do is, like Ali said, put in load management. Now, what load management will do, it'll either relate it back to the substation, to the network, to the wider grid, or to maybe your next door neighbour or your house. So if your demand does increase, what the load management will do, it will automatically throttle back the charge amount that's actually going to your vehicle. So it will charge it slower. And that's got to happen to balance the networks out. And now, how are they doing that? Why are they introducing that? As some people may or may not be aware, there's a new set of regulations which have already been published, and they're coming to force in July, so end of June this year. And they're called the Electric Vehicles Smart Charge Point Regulations. And they say exactly that. It's there to increase the actual smart connectivity of charge points. Currently, the previous charge points just have to be internet enabled to qualify for the grant. So the end user can see on their app what the car's drawing, etc. And that was about it. With the new regulations which are coming in June this year, all charge points that are fitted have to be fully smart enabled, which will then allow them to communicate back to a central point, a central network. Now, people think Big Brother's watching me, they're going to control everything that I do. In part, yes, they are, but they have to manage the peak demand on the network. There is the power available, but they just have to manage it. So, a few main points on the new electric vehicle smart charge point regulations that are coming in. One thing is default off-peak charging. We all know that the peak demand in our properties on our UK power networks is somewhere between about 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock and about 7 o'clock on an evening. We've all heard horror stories that when it comes to Coronation Street adverts, everybody rushes to put the kettles on, send the peak demand through the roof. If everybody's charging their cars at the same time, that's obviously not going to work. So the default setting on every new smart point fitted will be charging off-peak. That can be overridden by the user. So people think, well, what's the point in doing that? How many people will override it? And obviously, once it gets to a point where the grid is starting to build up too much, the national grid will just wipe your smart point charger back down to default overnight anyway. So that's one main thing that's coming in. Random delay feature. So again, every new smart charge point fitted after June will have to have a random delay feature on it. So when you plug it in, it will not start charging immediately. It could be up to 10 minutes later that it actually starts at a random delay set by the network. And again, the idea is everybody comes home at 5:30, plugs in the car charge point, that instant sudden surge needs to be balanced out, needs to be spread around. That's going to give anxiety to a lot of users because they'll come home, plug the car in, and then expect to see it charging ready for the next day. But it won't charge instantly. It could be 5 seconds, it could be 10 minutes later, it actually starts. But again, it's about UK power networks managing the network loading. Another thing that's coming in is the smart meter changing. Throughout the industry where we've had so many generations of smart meters, you get your new smart meter change and it stops speaking to anything. It becomes a dumb meter. You sign up with Shell Energy, next week you transfer to EDF Energy, your smart meter goes back to being dumb again. Under the new regulations, the charge point cannot lose its connectivity or smart capability if you change suppliers or providers. That has to be maintained no matter what provider or supplier you are with. Another change that's coming in is data logging. So every new meter, every new charge point has to be able to accurately measure the energy that that actual charge point either imports or exports, and store that data for 12 months for analytical purposes. So that's another good thing. With them being smart meters network controlled as well, when we get more vehicles that can do vehicle to grid transfer. So when the national grid at a time of high demand, they'll be able to switch your smart meter over and export your battery energy back onto the grid. So that's your battery storage systems. That's starting to come. There's only a few cars that are actually available and designed to be able to do that at the moment, but that is coming in slowly. Any more thoughts on that, either Ali or Paul?
Just only one thing is the government regulations concerning fossil fuel engines. I mean, 2030, you won't be able to buy them anymore.
Your normal dumb chargers.
Sorry?
You won't be able to buy your normal dumb chargers, as it were, your normal charge point.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the vehicles there. I mean, it's just a point to note that this is where it's going. It's just, we talk about getting used to getting the idea of electrical vehicle. We're also being pushed into it by government legislation as well. So we're heading down that either hybrid or fully electric cars.
It's also worth noting, I think, that after, is it 2025, when gas boilers won't be installed in new properties, so it'll be electric heating, which will further presumably increase the demand on off-peak times, which makes the randomized delay for charging EV vehicles and that spreading out the demand overnight even more important than it is at the moment.
Yeah, good point.
There is a question, which is the random delay just for domestic, or does it also apply to commercial?
And I'll just quickly reply to that one. It's essentially all charge points, with the exception of your rapid chargers. Excuse my spelling mistake. With the exception of rapid chargers over, I believe it's 48 kilowatts.
Yeah.
So all your standard up to 11, 22 kilowatt chargers, they will all have to have this random delay on them, unfortunately.
But there is also the fact that if you've got commercial, if it's a big commercial industrial site, the business owner can control it as well, use load curtailment to sort of even out their demand throughout the day as well. So that's slightly different, but related to that.
It is domestic, industrial and commercial properties. They're just worked on the maximum demand with your supply agreement. So you've got your local power supplier who gives you your maximum demand for that industrial unit. And then providing you don't exceed that, you don't need to notify the DNO. It's just purely the domestic ones where you do. I think that's almost a pretty good conclusion. I've also got to try and promote develop. So if anybody does want to look into any of the courses that we offer, have a pop over to our website. We do offer the Sitting Guilds 291901 course, which is the full scope one. We offer it slightly differently to some other companies where we do it over 2 days, but day one is virtual and day two is in centre doing the actual assessments. We feel that works better, and we've done it that way purely off the back of industry feedback. Too many people are concerned obviously with the coronavirus and the additional expense of sending somebody off site for 2 days, potentially 50, 60 mile round trip. So do the theory part, sat in front of your laptop like we are now, obviously a bit more interactive, and then come back again and into one of our centres and do the actual charge point practical assessments. Any final words from my panelists?
No, I think we've pretty much covered all the key points. Yeah.
Right, I'm just going to have a quick look at some of the questions.
Yes.
So larger domestic charge point main three-phase supply is required. Absolutely does. At the moment, single phase supply, you're looking at a maximum of 7 kilowatt. Anything over 7 kilowatt, if you're looking at the 11 or 22 kilowatt charge points in a commercial building, then you are looking at the three-phase supply. And the next one, what happens if you come to your car and it's not been charged due to the random charging or the battery's been drained? It does create major consumer inconvenience. Absolutely, totally agree with that. I would hope when the actuals do start implementing the vehicle to grid on a more wide scale, there will be safeguards in place. So the random charging, it will only put a random charge on when you plug it in for up to 10 minutes. Now, if you're plugging it in overnight, then that 10 minutes isn't really going to be an issue. I don't see that being an issue at all. But actual draining your vehicle and feeding it back onto the grid, that can be a significant issue. But I would like to think there will be safeguards put in place. And when that does actually happen on a nationwide scale, I would expect there's going to be another set of guidance come out by the UK Power Network. It's actually controlling that. At the moment, that's just more in concept stage rather than practically applied at the moment.
I'm just wondering, Stuart, with these smart meters that they also communicate. I mean, I'm just thinking of the head where they might communicate with the car and say, what is your average mileage distance? So, I mean, if you're just locally commuting, then maybe take out of the battery so it leaves you sufficient and a percentage for safety that you can still do your commute. I'm just wondering if that might be something that they'll do for the future. It's just an idea, really, just going buzzing through my head.
The technology is already there, so why can't it be implemented? Yeah.
I think that could be the way round it later on down in the future, maybe. So it's just very much the case of like, yeah, they won't drain your battery. I don't think they'll leave you sufficient to do the average commute miles that you're doing, because that's what you really do, is to and from work, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Right, I think we've come to a natural conclusion. So I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us. I hope you've got something out of today. I certainly have, because I don't know everything, and Paul and Ali have contributed and topped up my knowledge as well. So that's always good. I say thanks very much for joining us. I hope it's been informative. If there's anything else, drop us a line through our customer services desk. Some of our customer services team will be in touch with some of the attendees after this session just to see how we think it went. We have recorded the session as well, so that is going to be available to be published at a later date as well. So if anybody needs a copy of it, so a couple of people have commented about the actual volume, or they've had to mute things because in a loud office, not a problem whatsoever. To get in touch, we'll happily share a copy with you. On that note, I'd like to say thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Paul.